The morning my business partner tried to push me out of my own company, he was wearing the new suit I had helped him pay for. That detail probably sounds petty, but when you spend 11 years building something from nothing with someone, you notice things like that. You notice the Italian wool, the pocket square, the way he straightened his jacket before walking into the boardroom like he already owned the room, like he already owned everything inside it. My name is James Calloway. I grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, in a house where my father worked double shifts at a steel plant and my mother stretched every grocery run like it was a military operation. Nobody handed us anything. I learned early that the only things worth keeping were the things you built yourself. So when I was 31, I built something. A small structural engineering consultancy that started in the spare bedroom of my condo in Waterloo. No investors, no safety net. Just a laptop, a drafting table I bought secondhand off Kijiji, and a contact list I had been quietly growing for 6 years working under other people. I brought in a partner 2 years later. His name was Scott Hargrove. We had worked together at the same firm downtown, and he had what I lacked at the time, a natural ease with clients, the kind of handshake confidence that closes deals in a golf club parking lot. I was the one who stayed until midnight checking load calculations. He was the one who made sure there were clients paying for those calculations. For a while, that balance worked. The company grew steadily. By the time we were 9 years in, we had 14 full-time employees, contracts with 3 municipal governments in Ontario, and a reputation that had taken us years to build carefully. We weren't flashy. We didn't advertise. We survived on referrals and repeat business, which is the only kind of growth that actually holds. Then Scott's father-in-law retired. His name was Gerald Haas, a property developer out of Mississauga, with a long reach and a short patience for people who didn't agree with him. I had met him at company Christmas dinners and a few golf outings, and I had always kept a polite distance. He was the kind of man who asked questions that were really statements, and who smiled in a way that never quite reached his eyes. When Gerald retired, he apparently decided that keeping himself busy meant inserting himself into his son-in-law's career. Scott started showing up to meetings with ideas that didn't sound like Scott. New operational structures, a proposal to renegotiate ownership percentages based on a quote-unquote updated valuation of non-technical contributions. That last one, delivered over lunch at a restaurant Scott had chosen, was when I understood that the conversation had already been happening without me. I didn't say much that afternoon. I asked a few clarifying questions, said I'd review the proposal, and drove home quietly. That evening I called my uncle. My uncle Raymond is the person I go to when I need to think clearly. He spent 30 years as a civil litigator in Toronto before he retired to a property outside of Guelph where he grows tomatoes and pretends to read novels. He doesn't give advice unless you ask directly, and when you ask, he doesn't dress it up. I explained the situation. The renegotiation proposal, the shift in Scott's behaviour over the past 8 months, the way Gerald had started appearing at our office for what Scott called casual visits, but always seemed to coincide with conversations about company direction. My uncle listened without interrupting, which is rare for him. When I finished, there was a pause. Then he said, "Let him take it." I sat with that for a moment. Let him take it. The company I had built from a second-hand drafting table. The contracts I had spent a decade cultivating. The name on the incorporation documents that I had filed myself at the Ontario Business Registry at 2 in the morning because I couldn't afford a lawyer yet. I asked him to explain. He said, "Not yet. First, go see a good corporate lawyer. Tomorrow, don't wait." That was the beginning of the part of this story that nobody else saw. I want to be honest about the years before all of this, because the boardroom moment only makes sense if you understand the years leading up to it. When I brought Scott into the partnership, I was 23 months into running the company alone. I was exhausted in a way that I couldn't explain to people who hadn't done it. The loneliness of it, more than anything, was what I wasn't prepared for. Every decision lands on you. Every mistake is yours. Every sleepless night spent staring at a structural drawing, wondering if you missed something, wondering if a wall you signed off on is going to fail somewhere. That's not a weight you can share easily. Scott came in and the weight redistributed. That felt like relief. And because it felt like relief, I was grateful for longer than I should have been. Looking back, the signs were small at first. Scott would describe the company's growth at networking events in a way that erased the distinction between what he had contributed and what I had. He'd say things like, "When we designed that bridge," when he hadn't been in a single technical meeting on that project, I didn't correct him in public because it seemed petty. Because we were partners, and I thought it didn't matter. It mattered. Not because of credit. I genuinely don't need credit. But because the story he was telling about himself was slowly becoming the story other people believed, and I had quietly allowed it. His father-in-law believed it completely. I think Gerald had decided early on that Scott was the real engine of the company and I was the technical support. A good employee with a title. The restructuring proposal he helped engineer wasn't personal, exactly. It was simply that he didn't see me as the kind of person who builds something. He saw me as someone who maintains it. That distinction would eventually cost him considerably. The corporate lawyer I found was a woman named Patricia Wren, based in Kitchener. She came recommended by two separate people I trusted, and within 20 minutes of our first meeting I understood why. She had a way of asking questions that felt less like gathering information and more like dismantling assumptions, including mine. She reviewed our partnership agreement, which was thorough, but had been drafted before the company had reached anything close to its current value. She asked about intellectual property, specifically, whose name was on the methodology documentation we used for our municipal assessment contracts. Mine. She asked about client relationships, specifically, which clients had primary contact with me versus Scott. The majority, mine. She asked about the technical certifications that the company's licensure was contingent upon. Mine. She put her pen down and looked at me across the conference table. The proposal he brought you, she said, would give him operational control based on a valuation framework that ignores the assets the company actually runs on. She paused. Do you understand what I'm saying? I said I did. Don't sign anything, she said, and don't tell him you've been here. Over the following 6 weeks, Patricia and I worked through a restructuring of a different kind. Not to push Scott out. That was never my intention, and it would have been legally complicated regardless. But to accurately document what the company was actually built on. The proprietary assessment methodology I had developed over 8 years. The municipal contracts, 3 of which were tied directly to my engineering license and my relationships with the project leads. The technical staff, most of whom had been hired by me and reported to me. We also documented something else Patricia had flagged. Scott had been sharing preliminary project data with a development company Gerald owned a stake in. Nothing that crossed into obvious illegality, but enough to raise questions about conflict of interest, particularly on 2 contracts where Gerald's development company had subsequently submitted competitive bids. I had suspected something like this. I hadn't had words for it until Patricia gave me the file. I want to say something here about that period, because I think it's the part of the story people expect to be about anger. It wasn't, really. Or not in the way I expected. There's a specific loneliness in discovering that someone you trusted was operating on a version of the partnership that had different rules for you than for them. It doesn't feel like rage, at least not at first. It feels more like standing in a room you've lived in for years and realizing the walls aren't where you thought they were. I kept going to work. I kept attending meetings with Scott, reviewing drawings, responding to client emails. I was polite, I was professional. I gave him no indication that anything had changed. My staff noticed I was quieter than usual. One of my senior engineers, a careful and observant man who had been with the company for 6 years, asked me once if everything was okay. I told him work was heavy. He nodded and didn't push. That was the hardest part. Not the legal preparation, not the late nights reviewing documentation with Patricia. The hardest part was sitting across from someone at a weekly operations meeting and performing normalcy while knowing what was coming. The shareholder meeting Scott called was framed as a routine governance review. He had brought in an outside consultant, someone Gerald had used before, to present an updated valuation and a recommendation for operational restructuring. The recommendation predictably proposed shifting primary decision-making authority to the managing partner role, which Scott held, while the technical director role, mine, would become advisory in nature. Scott's wife was there, which surprised me. She sat beside her father near the window, and I remember thinking she looked more uncomfortable than triumphant. Gerald sat at the end of the table with the particular stillness of a man who has already decided how the meeting ends. The consultant presented for 40 minutes. When he finished, Scott looked at me across the table the way people look at someone they've already written off. James, he said, we think this is the right direction for the company's next phase. We. I had always found that word interesting in the context of business, the way it expands and contracts depending on whose interests it serves. I let the consultant's presentation sit in the air for a moment. Then I opened the folder in front of me and slid a document across the table to Scott. It was a formal notice, prepared by Patricia, documenting the conflict of interest concerns, specifically the sharing of preliminary project data with a development company connected to Gerald's holdings, on 2 projects where that company had subsequently submitted bids. It referenced the relevant clauses in our partnership agreement and the applicable provisions under Ontario's Business Corporations Act. Scott's expression changed in a way I hadn't seen before. Not anger, something quieter and more uncomfortable than that. Gerald leaned forward. "What is this?" It wasn't really a question. "It's documentation," I said, "that Patricia Wren's office has been preparing for about 6 weeks. Gerald looked at Scott. Scott looked at the document. His wife looked at her hands. The outside consultant, to his credit, said nothing and began slowly gathering his papers. The meeting did not end the way Scott had planned. What followed over the next several months was not dramatic in the way people might expect. There were no shouting matches, no public confrontations, no moments that would translate well to a film. It was mostly legal correspondence, careful negotiation, and a gradual unwinding of a partnership that had run its course. Scott and I reached a settlement. He received a buyout for his share of the company at fair market value. Not the inflated figure Gerald's consultant had proposed, but a legitimate number that Patricia's team had independently verified. It was a substantial amount of money, and I want to be clear that I didn't begrudge him it. He had contributed real value for real years, and the settlement reflected that. What he did not receive was ongoing access to client relationships, proprietary documentation, or any claim on the municipal contracts. Those remained with the company. Because legally, structurally, and practically, that's where they had always been. Gerald's development company was referred to the relevant professional association for review regarding the bid submissions on the 2 contracts where conflict of interest concerns had been identified. I did not pursue it aggressively. I filed the documentation and let the process work. From what I understood through Patricia's office, the outcome was not pleasant for them, but I was not involved in the details and I didn't try to be. One thing I want to say about my uncle's advice, because I've thought about it often since. When he told me to let Scott take it, I initially heard surrender. I heard a lifetime of work handed over to someone who hadn't earned it, and I was already calculating, in the 40 seconds between his words and my response, what I would lose. But what my uncle understood, and what I only understood later, was that if I had walked into that boardroom meeting trying to fight, trying to hold on, trying to win in the room, I would have been fighting on terms that had been designed without me. The meeting was a performance. The real decisions were made in the documents, in the contract language, in the 6 weeks of preparation that happened before anyone sat down at that table. He wasn't telling me to give up. He was telling me to stop fighting the battle they wanted me to fight and start winning the one they didn't know I was in. I think about that distinction a lot. It's been about 3 years since the settlement. The company is still here. Different name now. I rebranded 18 months after the restructuring, which turned out to be a useful opportunity to update our positioning and pick up 2 new municipal clients in the process. The staff who stayed made the choice to stay, which told me something important about the foundation I had actually built versus the one I had imagined I was building. The work is quieter now. I don't have a partner, which means I carry more of the weight alone again. But it's a different kind of weight than the early years. It doesn't feel like uncertainty. It feels more like clarity. My uncle came down from Guelph in the spring and we sat on my back deck in Burlington with coffee and watched his dog investigate the yard. He asked how things were going, and I gave him an honest answer, which is that things were going well in ways that were hard to quantify. He nodded and didn't say much. That's his way. After a while, he said, "You know what I was actually telling you that night on the phone?" I said I thought I did. I was telling you that you already had everything you needed. You just had to stop defending things that weren't under threat. I've turned that over in my head more times than I can count. The house I built in Hamilton when I was 34 is still mine. The engineering license I renewed last November is still mine. The methodology that 7 years of late nights and thousands of calculations went into is still mine. The client who called me personally 2 months after the restructuring to say he was glad I was still in the picture, that was mine too, in the way that actually matters. What I lost was a partnership that had already been something other than what I thought it was. What I lost was a version of things I had been maintaining out of habit and loyalty, long after the version itself had quietly changed. That's not loss, really. Not the kind worth grieving. There's a particular kind of person who looks at someone who builds things quietly and decides that the quietness means the building isn't happening. They see the absence of noise and read it as absence of substance. And for a while, a long while, in my case, I let that misreading stand because correcting it felt like it required more energy than it was worth. It doesn't, actually, but you have to get to a point where you understand that silence is a strategy, not a concession. Scott reached out once, about 8 months after everything was finalized. A short email. He said he hoped I was well, that he thought about the early years sometimes, that he was sorry things had ended the way they had. It was a genuine email, I think. Not strategic. Just a person looking back at something and feeling complicated about it. I replied briefly. I wished him well. I meant it. There's no version of this story that requires me to be angry at Scott specifically. He made decisions I would not have made. He allowed someone, his father-in-law, a man with strong opinions and access to capital, to shape his thinking about what he deserved and what I was. That's a failure of a kind, but it's a human one. I've made my own versions of it. Gerald I have less generosity for, if I'm being honest. Not because of what he tried to take, but because of what he clearly believed about people like me. That a person who works carefully and quietly and builds things steadily over years is somehow less real than a person who walks into rooms with confidence and makes large claims. He had decided what I was before he ever shook my hand. That kind of certainty, in my experience, always costs something eventually. I don't know what it cost him specifically. I didn't keep track. What I kept track of was my kids. I have two, a daughter who is 9 and a son who is 7, and I want to say something about them because they're the part of this story that I don't talk about publicly, but that was present for all of it. During the 6 weeks of preparation with Patricia and then the months of settlement negotiations, I showed up for school pickup every Tuesday and Thursday. I made dinner most nights. I coached my son's hockey team on Saturday mornings, in a cold arena in Aldershot, and drank bad coffee from a thermos, and watched 8-year-olds try to turn without falling over. I did those things not to document them, not to create a record, but because they were the most important things in my life, and I refused to let the situation shrink them. The situation was going to take exactly as much space as I gave it, and I tried to give it as little as possible. My daughter, at one point during that period, asked me why I seemed tired. I told her work was complicated for a while, but that it was going to get simpler. She looked at me in the serious way she has and said, "You seem okay though." That was the most useful thing anyone said to me during that entire period. I did seem okay, because I was okay, or at least the part of me that mattered was okay. The part of me that was her father, that had built something real from real work over real years, that understood the difference between what could be taken and what couldn't. That part was fine. The rest of it was just paperwork. There's a version of this story I could tell where the moral is about strategy, about preparation, about not showing your hand until the right moment. That version is true as far as it goes. The preparation mattered, Patricia's work mattered. My uncle's advice, stripped of sentiment and given plainly in a phone call when I needed it, mattered. But I don't think that's actually the lesson. The lesson, at least the one I keep coming back to, is about what you know versus what you perform. For years I had been performing a partnership, showing up, contributing, keeping peace, without fully acknowledging, even to myself, what I actually knew about what that partnership had become. I kept the peace because I told myself it mattered more than the truth. And it didn't. It never does in the end. The day you stop performing what you want to be true and start acting on what you actually know, that's the day things start to move in the right direction. It doesn't feel like a victory when it happens. It feels like a conversation you should have had earlier, finally starting. 3 years on, I still drive past the old office on King Street sometimes. Different company in there now. Different sign on the door. I don't feel much when I see it, which I think means I've actually processed it rather than just stored it somewhere. What I feel most days is something quieter and more durable than anything I expected to find on the other side of all of this. I feel like someone who built something that held, not because the walls were the strongest or the foundation was the deepest, but because I built it on things that were actually mine. Work I had done, knowledge I had earned, relationships I had tended carefully over years. You can't take any of that in a boardroom. You can try to reassign the paperwork, but the actual thing, the thing that makes the company run, the thing clients call about, the thing that shows up at 8-year-olds hockey practice every Saturday morning regardless of what's happening at work, that stays exactly where it was. Nobody can vote you out of what you actually built, and no settlement, no restructuring, no consultant's presentation in a conference room in Mississauga can change what you know to be true when you're standing in your own kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, long after the kids are in bed, looking at the work you've done and understanding, finally, and without needing anyone else to confirm it, that it was real.